we were talking before the break about escapement goal setting in Bristol Bay. And my next question is, how are escapement goals met in Bristol Bay? Is there a difference in how they manage to meet their escapement goals?
Yes, so the goals are, once defined, they become the primary objective of the fisheries management biologist, the area management biologist. To achieve that goal, that's what they're evaluated on pretty much solely post-season, whether they've been able to get the escapement above the lower line and somewhere between the lines is good.
In your summary on page 165, you talk about the high variability in returns and uncertainty associated with optimum escapement goals for Fraser sockeye, resulting in managers and fishers selecting more complex abundance-related harvest rules to set management goals. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so the goals vary with run size on the Fraser, so they're substantially different from ones which are the same, not only for all different sizes of runs, but across years. And there isn't the, as I started to point out there, I guess there's only one stock in Bristol Bay that has this cyclic pattern, like some of the Fraser stocks have, and even that has been much less in recent years. So they define the goals for a particular population and strive to achieve those. And whereas in the Fraser scenario, while people are defining goals, they vary substantially, and it's more of an escapement target, I guess, is the best way to describe what's done in the Fraser, as opposed to a specific goal for a specific stock. So they define escapement targets by run timing group.
Whereas the goals are on a stock basis in Bristol Bay?
Yes.
And is that partially a result of the fact that stocks, they don't have as much of a mixed stock fishery in Bristol Bay, and that they are all going to different river systems?
Well, it gives them more latitude, I guess, to control the fisheries to achieve a specific goal. So they're not having to balance the goals for multiple stocks, but they do have that within the different districts. They'll have subpopulation goals, but the one that should be really clear is the goal that the primary goal that they're striving for is whatever goal they set for that particular district, not for the subcomponent stocks.
So maybe it's not a run timing group, but it's more of but it is an aggregate of certain stock groups.
Yes.
Okay. Moving to preseason forecasts, how are preseason forecasts generated in Bristol Bay?
So they use a lot of the same tools as the ones in for the Fraser. They have, I think there's a whole list of them described under that in the report. I don't remember what page the preseason forecast is on. Just find that here quickly. So it's where the description of the forecast methods is on page 146. And right at the bottom of that page, it talks about actually that's the in-season one.
Perhaps on 149.
149. Okay, yes, that's what I was looking for. So preseason, top of 149. So they're using what they refer to as 4 types of models, very similar to the models that are used in the Fraser. These mean models, which refer to sort of average returns per spawner. There's stock recruitment models, which might be like the Larkin model or other Ricker models that look at relationships between spawners and recruits. Sibling models, meaning they use one age population to predict returns of another. So you're using a younger age return for sockeye. Because they have multiple ages of sockeye, that works better than in the Fraser, where you have most of the returns are age 4. And then smolt related models. So this is looking at the smolt output. They do a number of enumerations on outmigrating smolts for various stocks and look at the relationship between that and adult returns.
In your comparison section on page 166, you say that when all stocks are aggregated, median absolute percent error it appears slightly better for Bristol Bay than for the Fraser, but not by much. Can you just comment on that?
Yeah, so probably the graph to look at there is on page 152. So the top chart shows you the absolute percent error, and the bar once again shows you the median. So where the line goes through the box is the median. And if you actually look at the value, I think it's 25% is the value when you look at all systems combined. And that's the most far right box and whiskers. And then the districts, the 5 management districts are the next 5 things that you see on the graph there. And this is the top graph I'm referring to. And then you can see across the different, on the other side, left side of the dashed line are all the different major river systems within each of those districts. You can see by the bottom which ones are in each of the districts. They should have color coded the ones on the right hand side, then you could have seen that which ones refer to each of the districts. But the first, just so people know, there's Ignik or Egik just has one major river system, and then the first 2 have much. Togiak has one, and there's 3 in the Nak and Kwijak system. So there's the 3 dark bars refer to that, and then the last 3 are in the Noosh Wood Igu district. I think the important part of this graph is that you saw the previous one for Fraser, the length of the whiskers, the amount of variability in any one given year is substantially less for Alaska forecast compared to returns than what we're seeing in for Fraser.
But just picking up on what you have to say in your summary paragraph, I take it the lower figure is similar to the figure 10 we saw for Fraser sockeye, and you see all systems are given a 48% R value for reliability. Is that right?
Yeah, so that's the R square value that compares with the 44% for Fraser for the entire Fraser River.
Right. So the differences appear more on the individual stock level.
Yes, and also in the biggest difference is in the absolute percent error as opposed to the R value.
And is there a reason why the pre-season forecasts in Bristol Bay have a lower absolute percent error than on the Fraser system?
Yes, that's mostly because of this portfolio effect, the diversity of populations, and also the stability of returns assists in that, as does the lack of cyclic dominance. So you have more consistent returns year to year in Bristol Bay than you do in the Fraser.
So is it fair to say that the better accuracy you see on the individual stock level analysis results not so much from better models in Bristol Bay, but really just the predictability on a biological level with the stocks themselves?
Yeah, there's that element. Another one I should mention is this: they're using more consistently the same model for each of these populations year in and year out, which may provide, and seems to suggest that it provides a greater degree of precision. If you look at the look on page 153, it shows the trends in mean absolute percent error across time. So that's figure 35. And you can see that in the most recent period, 2001 to 2010, the mean absolute percent error has been reduced over what it was historically. And it's in that period when they started using the model that has performed best in a number of years, not just the most recent year.
Okay, thank you. In-season estimates, in your summary section, your comparison section to BC, focusing on the differences, what are the differences in the way in-season estimates are generated in Bristol Bay as compared to the Fraser system?
Okay, so that's back on page 146. It talks about the different in-season estimation methods used. Right at the bottom of this page. So in terms of in-season, they have an offshore test fishery at Port Moller. This is a gillnet test fishery, not dissimilar to some of the gillnet test fisheries that are used in British Columbia. Then they have district test fishing. They have commercial fishery performance with catch and age sampling. So that's looking at the actual fisheries information. They might have a test fishery inside the commercial fishery, which looks at fish that are escaping that particular district fishery. They have aerial surveys where they might count quantities of fish on the air, as well as escapement monitoring, which is lower down in the river system.
Right. Is in-season estimation used by fisheries managers in Bristol Bay to manage the fishery in the same way in-season estimation is used by Fraser River managers?
Yes.
Okay. Do the Bristol Bay fishery managers rely on in-season estimation to the same extent as Fraser River managers do?
Yes, they rely very heavily on it.
All right, and in your summary underneath the heading in-season forecast, you state in-season forecasting is of limited use to Bristol Bay managers who rely mostly on daily escapement counts and day-to-day movements of fish in the districts to manage the fishery. So do I take it from that when you look at the 7 different methods that you just reviewed, the primary one used by managers in Bristol Bay is escapement monitoring and not so much the other test fishing methods, for example?
Yeah, the primary one is combining catch and escapement data. So they get catch data from the fishery immediately following the fishery, and then they have escapement data for the same period.
All right, and is that different from what happens in the Fraser?
Yes, because the catch information on the Fraser is, while it's used as is information on escapement, there's a greater reliance, I think, on looking at abundance using the test fisheries in approach waters. The fishing may be more sporadic as well, and it probably is more sporadic on the Fraser than it is in Bristol Bay when they have major fisheries happening every couple of days. So they're getting a lot of information from the fisheries. This is really more similar to what the situation was back 10 or 15 or 20 years ago on the Fraser, where they were using a lot more data from fisheries to do in-season assessments.
And has the situation in the Fraser changed such that it would not be reasonable to rely on catch and escapement as the primary methods of doing in-season estimates in the Fraser system today?
Well, if you don't have a fishery, you'd be waiting for just the escapement information, and the first escapement information you'd be using would be that from the Mission Hydroacoustic site, and there has been a number of difficulties with that site providing reliable estimates depending on the conditions in the year. And so it would be much more tenuous to just rely on that versus conducting some additional test fisheries in the ocean.
And in your conclusion on the Fraser River test in-season estimation process was that it was, in the Fraser system, a reliable system. Is that right?
Yeah, the reason why it has been developed and what makes it a more robust approach than relying on one thing or another is that you're looking at abundances of fish as they're moving through the approach waters in Johnson Straits or Juan de Fuca, and then assessing for the early Stewart, early summer, and summer timing groups, how many of those fish are passing Mission. So you're comparing what is seen in the ocean test fisheries with what's seen at Mission, and it's giving you sort of two indications of whether, if one says there's a lot more fish and the other says a lot fewer fish, then you have red flag goes up that, hey, we may not be measuring as big a run as we thought. But if you see a consistency between those two, you have a different, higher comfort level. And they have been performing pretty well with that regard. The caveat is on late run where the fish don't move in every year right through to the Mission. So you have this gap of, could be 2-3 weeks of holding time or more in the lower Gulf. And so that doesn't give you the same degree of confidence on late run as it does in the other timing groups.
Are you suggesting that the Alaska method of in-season estimation is superior or would be better used on the Fraser system?
Well, it can't be done the same way as it's done in Alaska because things are confined more in space and time. You couldn't use it identically. But if you did have, if you change the fisheries to operate in those similar spaces and times where you have reliable information on escapement and good information on catch, and there was substantial catch, yeah, you could use the same system.
So if we limited our fishery to the mouth of the Fraser, for example? Is that what you're saying?
Well, no, you might, to have the exact analogy, you probably have to limit it to fishing more terminally than even the mouth of the Fraser. But because you don't have the stock, the ability to, because part of the Bristol Bay system should be clear to everybody is that they have the ability to turn on and off the fisheries for specific stocks, not just the whole fishery all at once. So they can close one district, open another district, move it around depending on what stocks they want to target.
And this is because there's multiple rivers in that fishery, is that right?
Multiple rivers and geographic separation between the fisheries.
Right, so that's not an option for the Fraser system.
It's not an option with the current model for how the Fraser's managed with marine interception fisheries and lower river interception fisheries. Yeah.
Okay. Escapement enumeration and abundance estimates. I'll deal with these together. How is escapement enumeration conducted in Bristol Bay?
All right, so that's described in a section here. In a nutshell, they rely heavily on these tower counts, which are located a short distance from fishery, so in the lower river. The big difference in Bristol Bay with regard to the enumeration is that the rivers they're enumerating sockeye return to, you can see the fish. So they're actually visible, and they have towers, which is a counting platform raised up above the shoreline so that you can look out and count fish moving past a certain point. And they also use acoustic systems on one of the rivers. But the tower counts, the vast majority of the escapement information has come from these tower counts.
And is there a count done on the spawning grounds in Bristol Bay?
They do not rely on spawning ground counts and don't put a lot of effort, because if you looked at that map we had out before, you'd see that the spawning areas are spread out over quite a range of locations, and they would be costly to go in and enumerate at all those different spots, and they don't believe that they're going to get a more reliable estimate than from the tower counts.
And is there any catch of any significance past the counting stations that must be accounted for in their escapement enumeration?
No. So that's the reason for having more confidence. That plus the shorter distance between the tower counts and where the spawning grounds are. So you're not losing, there's no indication that they lose substantial numbers of fish through mortality, and they know that they don't have significant fisheries above those towers.
All right, so given those differences, could the escapement enumeration system from Bristol Bay be used reliably on the Fraser system?
Not if the first escapement enumeration site is at Mission, because there's lots of both fisheries and other sources of mortality between Mission and the spawning grounds.
Okay. Given the differences between estimates at Mission and on the spawning grounds in the Fraser system, which we didn't talk about today, but we have heard quite a lot about earlier in the hearings, and also the distances traveled by spawners after Mission, is there anything from the Bristol Bay escapement enumeration systems or abundance estimating processes that we can learn from here on the Fraser system? Does Bristol Bay have any lessons for us that we should be paying attention to here on that topic?
Yeah, I think it's just the basic one that it's easy, obviously easier to manage multiple stocks in terminal stock-specific fisheries than it is in mixed stock fisheries.
And the mixed stock fishery is what we have here in the Fraser system. Mr. Commissioner, I don't have time, I don't think, to go through the state of science in the report Project 7. It's clearly laid out, though, in the state of the science, and so I'll leave it as read, and same with the recommendation section. And I'd like to turn the questioning over to Mr. Taylor for Canada at this time.
If I could add one point before I leave, because I did make a mistake earlier that was pointed out to me by Randall Peterman, was that when I quoted the age structure associated with Table 28, so if you could pull that Table 28 back up. It's on page 157. This is for Bristol Bay. Again, it's the 1.2 age group. That is our 4-year-old fish, 1 year in freshwater and 2 full years in the ocean. They come back after 4 years. The 1.3 would be 5-year-old fish, as would be 2.2 fish, both 5-year-olds, and then 2.3 would be 6-year-old fish. So I was 1 year off in my total age. So you have both 4, 5, and 6-year-old fish representing significant portions of returns in Bristol Bay, where in the Fraser it's primarily age 4.
We're counsel for the participant Government of Canada, Mr. English, and that of course includes the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. Mr. Commissioner, I understand 70 minutes, 70, starting at 2:25. Mr. English, I have some questions that mostly focus on 2 areas. We think your report is mostly solid, and commend the report. There are 2 areas of concern and questions associated with them. One has to do with your treatment of the preseason forecasts, and the other has to do with consideration of the TAM rules, which I'll come to each of those. I have a number of questions on various other statements in your report and matters arising from what's said. Before we go into the content of the report, let me ask you this. I understand that there's multiple authors to this report and you're the lead author, is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And can you say which parts of this report you wrote?
Yes. It might be easier to say what parts the other people wrote.
That would be fine.
Okay, so Bob Bocking focused mostly on the recreational fishery component. The in-season, preseason and in-season forecasting component for the BC the Fraser side of things was done by Tim Edgell. The Alaska section was drafted by Michael Link and Scott Rayborn. And of course I edited and contributed to all those sections in one form or another, but the rest of the report was primarily written by me and edited by them.
All right, and I take it then that you reviewed everything before it came before the commission.
That's correct, yes.
Thank you. So specifically then, the pre-season forecasting was written by Tim Edgill, was it?
Edgell, yes.
Edgill, thank you. And what particular expertise does he have? I've read his resume, but can you capsulize in a nutshell what is his expertise? He says to be an ecologist and analytical biologist.
Yes. Well, he's a good statistician in terms of can do analysis with any numbers, whether they're coming from Fraser sockeye fisheries or other sources. Has a good statistical background, and that was the main reason for focusing in on the data sets which were provided by the department and just analyzing them with regard to some very specific tasks.
Okay. Am I correct then that your expertise is not particularly focused on pre-season forecasting?
Well, I don't know. We've done a fair bit of work with preseason forecasts, not as extensive as what's being done on the Fraser. I've been involved with other fisheries in the Nass and Skeena looking at forecasting methods, but it wouldn't be an area where I've spent a lot of my time.
All right.
Some.
Is your knowledge and experience focused mainly on in-season work?
I guess most of the stuff that I've personally done has been trying to design programs to improve the information available for fisheries management. Some of those are in season, some of them are more post-season in escapement monitoring programs, but also catch monitoring and run size estimation.
All right. In the consideration in your report of pre-season forecasts, as I read it, you or your firm or Mr., and I apologize, I hope I'll get it right before the end of these questions. Edgill?
Edgill, yeah.
All right, thank you.
Think about the razor, edge.
All right,
Edge and gel.
I'll do that.
There you go.
For the moment, I'll say his. His writing seems to regard the pre-season forecasts as point distributions, and by that I mean the number that's given as the 50% number is taken as a point distribution as distinct from a statement of probability.
That's correct.
So you agree with me that the report takes it as a point distribution?
That's right.
Now, would you agree with me, though, that really what that is what I said a moment ago? It's a statement of probability. So, for example, there's a 50% chance that the run size is going to be more or less than the number that's then stated.
Yes.
All right. And I want to, if I may, take you to some evidence that's been given already in these proceedings. It's evidence of Sue Grant, who's a Department of Fisheries and Oceans biologist. It's on January 26th, and I'm at page 45. Am I right that you know Sue Grant?
Yes, I do, yes.
All right. She's a well-respected biologist, fisheries biologist, is she?
I think she must be. She's been doing a lot of work on these issues.
All right. But you say she must be. Do you agree she is?
Well, I know of her work, and the stuff I've seen I think is good quality. I don't know what other people's opinion of her are.
All right. Now, at page 45, about 2/3 of the way down the page, in a large paragraph that begins so, and this is Sue Grant speaking in answer to questions by Ms. Baker. And you can see The question at the top essentially is asking Ms. Grant about whether the preseason forecasts are reliable or unreliable, or accurate or inaccurate, or is it all a communication problem? And partway down that paragraph that begins so, about halfway down at line 26, there is a passage that's picking up in mid-sentence, and you can read the whole sentence for yourself there, but it says, DFO never expects the 50% probability. Let me start over. DFO never expects the 50% probability level to be what will return. That's a midpoint in the probability distribution, and we actually have a 1 in 2 chance that the run will come in above or below that actual value. So that value isn't a deterministic. DFO expects 10.6 million to come back. Do you agree with what she says there?
I think that's probably true, yeah, but I would imagine the reason for presenting a probability distribution is it defines the level of uncertainty associated with the preseason forecast. And we did include those, by the way, in our report.
All right.
The ranges.
And what you just said is a big part of the equation, isn't it? There's a high level of uncertainty with regard to forecasting Fraser Sockeye returns.
Yes, that's right.
And you've spoken to some of the reasons why, but when you're doing preseason forecasting, am I correct that you're looking to the past to predict the future?
That's right, yes.
And the theory is that if you have a long enough set of data that reaches back far enough in time, you're going to be better off than if you have only a short span of data, right?
Well, yes and no. If you're reaching back a long way in time and a lot of your data is associated with a time period that doesn't resemble the current time period's trends, then going back a long way is not going to be helpful. It might actually lead you astray.
Okay. If we could go to the chart in your report that's at page G2, that's the appendix we were in before. That chart has, as an approach, it seems to me, that you are using as a reference point the forecast number as a deterministic number, if I could put it that way, as distinct from a statement of probability.
That's correct, yes.
Would you agree with me that that makes that number then look more firm than it really is meant to be?
It definitely is a firm number that's being compared with another firm number, yes.
Sorry, could you say that again?
Yeah, it's trying to compare two firm estimates as opposed to a range of alternative estimates. So we're trying to get a sense of how close the return was to this point estimate of 50, which may be based on the 50 percentile.
Isn't it, though, comparing apples and oranges, because you're taking a statement of probability, you're turning it into, or pretending to turn it into, a deterministic number and then comparing it against the actual returns?
No, because there is a, whether the number is precise or imprecise because of uncertainty doesn't prevent those numbers from being used as to drive management planning process, which they're input in. So
right.
The harvest rates or the exploitation rate numbers, or the TAM rule, which you'll probably get into in a minute, is derived from picking a number within the range of the forecast and applying it to the TAM rule that comes out of the Frizzy process. And so you have to pick a number at some point. The range is useful to know. Useful for managers to know that there's a fair bit of uncertainty with the number. But part of the reasons for doing it this way was that we could compare forecasts in Alaska and in Bristol Bay with forecasts for Fraser in a head-to-head manner, and they don't use the same forecasting models exactly and these probability forecasts in Alaska.
Maybe I could put it another way, and I think you've spoken to this in your answer just now, and see whether I've got it right or you'll agree with me. Do you agree with me that there's a high level of uncertainty built into the probability forecast that you, for example, have then used to make the chart on page G2?
There, around the forecast estimate, there is a high degree of uncertainty. Yes.
And one of the elements of that uncertainty is that environmental conditions could make things turn out to be quite different from what might be forecast. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And so, in fact, if environmental conditions go off what we've seen in the historical time period, then the forecast is going to be probably off.
That's correct.
In terms of pre-season forecasting, are you aware of the terms of the Pacific Salmon Treaty that require that there be pre-season forecasting done?
Yes.
All right. So it's not an option, it has to be done, right?
That's correct, yes.
And do you agree that pre-season forecasting has value to it? I think you've spoken to this, but I want to be sure that
Yes.
I've got it right. So you're not quibbling with pre-season forecasting, you're more speaking to the particulars of what's done, are you?
I think my main point is that the forecasts have their use, but they're not used extensively in season because people rely more on in-season information, and that is the vital piece here because of all the reasons we just talked about: the uncertainty with the forecast, the changes associated with environmental conditions that could lead you to very different returns than what is forecast, as we've seen, most graphically in the last 2 years.
Okay. Well, let me suggest that there's at least 3 reasons for doing pre-season forecasting. One we've spoken about already, and that is it's required under the treaty. Mm-hmm. So secondly, and you were just speaking to managers' use of pre-season forecasting a moment ago, but let me suggest as a second reason, beyond that it's required under the treaty, that DFO managers use the pre-season forecasting early in season and early in the postseason to compare the current, to set up the current year against the long-term averages and get a sense of what's happening or going to happen. Mm-hmm. Do you agree
Yes.
that they use
Yeah.
it for that aim?
Yes.
All right. And then a third broad purpose I'll suggest to you as to why pre-season forecasting has value and it's useful to do is that it helps scientists to understand the population dynamics and the uncertainties associated with that.
Yes.
Okay. And if you come to the 2009, and then I'm going to come to the 2010 year, work that was done, and then I don't mean within fisheries, but within the science community, the work that was done and then the observations made, and I expect at some point in time there was a sort of, oh my gosh, what's going on here, realization by scientists. Were you were you engaged in that in 2009?
In the actual evaluations in season, do you mean, of what's going on?
Well, I don't mean doing the evaluations, but as part of the science community engaged in the something important and quite dramatic has happened here and is happening.
Well, it was evident. We were doing studies in 2009, which had the requirement for us to try and put tags on returning sockeye, and we were trying to allocate those across the run. And so from that perspective, I was involved in season to looking at what was going on with the run and talking with managers and people at the Salmon Commission about what was happening and whether the run was late, or a variety of different explanations for why we were not seeing anywhere near the numbers that we'd expected to return.
And so in the 2009 year, would you agree with me that with the preseason forecast in hand and then seeing what was starting to happen, or rather not happen, in terms of the non-return, would you agree with me that that allowed managers very quickly to understand that something important was happening and allow them to adjust their early in-season planning and actions accordingly to take account of that?
Well, what allowed them to do that was the in-season monitoring, because the forecast was just gave them a number to compare against, but they, assuming that they could define what their goals for that run were, they could have compared their goals for that particular return with what they were seeing in the test fisheries and at Mission, and said, okay, we have a problem. This run is way less than what we anticipate or would like to see return for that particular stock.
They could see in absolute terms that not very many fish were returning, but they could also see in those early days, couldn't they, that not only was there not many fish returning, but they could compare that lack of fish against what the probabilities were set out to be in the preseason forecasting and realize the magnitude of what was going on, if you like, because there was a comparator to put it against based
Sure.
on the preseason forecast, which in turn relies on historical returns.
Sure, but what I'm saying is that especially in these extreme cases, but even in less extreme cases, you could compare returns that occurred and what your test fishery tells you about returns in a given year with the size of returns that you expect or would like to see for a specific timing group of Fraser sockeye, and tell you right away whether, number one, is what we're seeing consistent with the timing we want the fish returning under and the abundance. So you could have thrown out the forecast entirely and just said, okay, we want to see X number of thousand fish and they should come in over this time period. Compared those numbers to what you would expect in the test fishery, and seen, boy, we're way under expectations, and therefore we need to close fisheries.
I think you're saying some of this, but I'd like to take you back into the transcript of the evidence of Sue Grant, if I may, January 26 again, at page 48. And she's speaking of the 2009 return, and she started doing that, and this is a continuation of the evidence that I took you to earlier, but she started, and just maybe for a moment, Mr. Lunn, if we could go to the bottom of page 47, you'll see that, that's fine, you'll see that it says, so 2009 we saw 1.3 million, and she goes on, and then over the page to page 48 and about halfway down at line 17, Ms. Grant says, so the forecasts are useful from that perspective, placing the returns in the perspective of what we have seen historically. Do you agree with that?
Whether it's a forecast that you're using or just an expectation based on trends with the stock, I guess there are different ways of doing the forecast, if you like. There's some kind of expectation you have to compare the returns to what you've seen and your goals for that stock.
All right. Just while we're here, towards the bottom of that page at line 36, Ms. Grant says, and this is now speaking to what the use that can be made of preseason forecasts, and in particular by managers, I expect. Line 36, so for preseason planning, early in-season early in-season run size models, I know she's speaking of managers, use the preseason forecast as a tool to help as a starting point for what we're seeing, what we expect to see. As in-season data becomes more and more available, these preseason forecasts start dropping off in terms of their usefulness as inputs into the model, but they're still useful from a qualitative perspective to place you on the map as to where you are. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
Do you agree that preseason forecasting has value in terms of showing or giving some early evidence as to fish productivity for that year?
Yeah, so you're going to compare your, or you're going to derive your preseason forecast from information you have on productivity. That's one of the models.
All right, okay. And do you see it as having preseason forecasting, that is, having value in terms of being able to map out where are the stocks and what is the timing as to them coming back by using the preseason forecast as against what you're starting to see as the season unfolds in its early days?
Yes?
Really shortly stated, having some evidence of what you can expect to come at you assists in giving context and perspective to what you in fact end up seeing happen.
Yeah, we all like to make a prediction, like with the playoffs, and hopefully it happens, right?
I've concluded that you're a hockey fan.
Well, you know, just imagine it's on some people's minds, so it might wake up.
All
a few
right.
people.
Well, hopefully it'll stay on Vancouver's minds for another couple of months or so, which would mean that they're doing well. Are you aware that the preseason forecast methodology that's been used and continues to be used by fisheries has been peer reviewed?
Yes?
And it's been given a thumbs up, right?
Yes, by the PSARC or CSAS method, or committees.
In an environment of high uncertainty, which you've spoken to on a number of occasions already in your evidence, but in an environment of high uncertainty to do with Fraser sockeye stocks, do you agree that it makes sense to estimate your preseason forecast in terms of probability as opposed to trying to be deterministic?
I think it's good for any biologist to express the uncertainty associated with their estimates when they can. They have the data to do it.
But
And
do you agree it's good to put it as a probability as distinct from trying to make a point distribution? Because you're bound to fail given the high variability if you try to be precise.
yeah, knowing what the point estimate is important for a number of parts of the process that's used, the current process that's used, but also understanding that it is variable and that you're communicating that, or the uncertainty is there, so you're communicating that to the users that don't put a huge amount of faith in the point estimate.
All right. Do you have knowledge of the approximate number of resources that DFO devotes to preseason forecasting?
Well, I know some of their best people that I've worked with in the past, people like Al Cass and others have allocated significant time preparing papers and preseason forecasts and models and analysis. I don't know exactly how long that takes for those people to do that, and whether they have that streamlined to the point where it's a relatively fast task.
I've been given some information that there's a relatively few people, relatively few biologists that are devoted to preseason forecasting. Is that your understanding?
I think there's been only a few people that have the full knowledge of these models and the methods, so they tend to rely on those few individuals, yes.
As I understand it, and the information given to me, it's a relatively modest amount of resources that are put into preseason forecasting in terms of the number of people, and it's only a portion of their time that do this. Does that accord with what you understand?
Yeah, as I say, I agree that it's probably only a few people. I have no idea how long it takes them to generate these forecasts. Some of these reports and documents are fairly complicated, and unless it's been really streamlined, I could see it taking a significant amount of time for some of them to do these and push it through the various approval systems that are in place to officially approve a forecast.
All right. And in doing this work, is it your understanding that fisheries is able to leverage things so that they engage with academics and the Pacific Salmon Commission and, if you like, have synergies and build and feed upon each other so that they can leverage and get greater gains than just the few resources fisheries puts into it.
So you mean getting help with this work from academics and the Salmon Commission?
Yes.
Sort of thing? Yeah, no, I'm sure they engage there wherever they can. Get that free, in quotes, labor.
Now, at page 64 of your report, Pre-Season Forecasting Methods, you cite there the CAS report of 2006, and you mentioned Al Cass a few moments ago. I take it you know of Mr. Cass, do you?
Yes, I do.
And that 2006 report that you cite in your paper at page 64 is Exhibit 351 in these proceedings. Will you agree with me that it's important to understand the pre-season forecasting and important to evaluate the pre-season forecasting to have regard to all of the papers and publications that are of recent vintage that bear on that topic, not just the one paper that you cite there?
Yeah, the focus for our report was clearly to look at the most recent information on forecasting and models, because a lot of things have changed in how these things have been done over the years, and we're trying to keep our report as a few pages as possible, believe it or not, but we didn't want to go back and have to describe all the history of forecasts from 1980 to present.
All right, but going the other direction, that is moving forward in time from 2006, there's another report I'm going to ask to have you look at. It's tab 11 to Canada's list of documents, and this is not an exhibit yet. This is document pre-season run size forecast for Fraser sockeye and pink in 2007. Are you familiar with that document?
Yes, that's also, I think, referenced in our...
Oh, is it? All right,
Yeah,
thank you.
In the following sentence, we reference the reports for 2006, 7, 9,
Oh, that's
10.
what that's, I see, I get it. And so one of those references is this report.
I would think that's the 2007 reference, unless it was done in a different year. No, it should be, that one probably would be the 2006, the CSAS 2006.
All right, well, that's fine.
Mr.
What I wanted
Commissioner,
to...
if I can give assistance, in the list of authorities at the back, you'll see the SAR number, and these authorities are all listed in.
Oh, thank you. What I wanted to take you to, though, is page 3 near the top. And as I understand it, for this year, that is 2007, there was a change made to the CAS 206 approach where the Larkin model was added in. Is that your understanding?
Yes?
And the Larkin model accounts for delay density effects as it sets out there.
Right.
Could the paper that I've just referred to, pre-season run size forecast for Fraser sockeye and pink for 207, be the next exhibit, please?
Exhibit number 724.
And then there's another paper I want to take you to, Mr. English, and you may point out to me that it too is cited in your paper, but let me check with you on this. It's tab 14 to Canada's list of documents. And this is what's commonly called Sue Grant's 2010 paper. Are you familiar with that?
I'm trying to think of whether I reviewed that one or not. I'm aware of its presence. I'm not sure whether I've actually reviewed it.
Okay. This is Exhibit 352 in these proceedings. Page 8 at the top, the models that were being used, and it's a paper that is amending the approach, as I understand it, that Mr. Cass had put in place in 2006. If you're not familiar with this paper, you may not be able to speak to that. But looking at it now, is this a paper you're familiar with?
We did produce a table in our report which looked at the different models that have been used in recent time period. Just trying to find it here. Be at the big 72. And but I think the information for 2010 was obtained from the CSAS 2010 report, not from the more detailed report by Sue.
All right. Will you agree with me, though, that DFO is keeping current and keeps on top of modeling approaches and is using the best model available for pre-season work for the year that they're doing it?
Yes.
Mr. Commissioner, do you want me to stop for the break now or continue on? All right. If I may, and I think this will be the last document I need to take you to, Mr. English, go to tab 6, if we may, of Canada's list. The CSAS paper, Pre-Season Run Size Forecast for Fraser River Sockeye 2010 by Sue Grant and others. If we go to tab 6 of Canada's documents, this is a paper from, I'm not sure what year at the moment, but we may find it as we go along, written by MacDonald, Patterson, and Haig, and Guthrie. Are you familiar with those authors?
Yes.
And they're reputable scientists in fisheries, are they?
Most certainly.
Pardon me?
I say most certainly.
All right. I thought you said most of them. Now, I want to go through some of the, not all of them, but just a couple of passages on this first page here. This is a paper modeling the influence of environmental factors on spawning migration mortality for sockeye salmon fisheries management in the Fraser River. You'll see on the first page there in the body of the paper, not in the abstract, in the first paragraph there's a sentence beginning, therefore. And it says, therefore, maintaining spawning populations may depend on our ability to provide a quantitative link between environmental factors and measures affecting productivity, including abundance, fish condition, migration success, and spawning success. And there's some citations. Do you agree with that statement?
Yes.
And then in the next paragraph it says, fisheries management has become more precautionary in recent years, in part because fish abundance has declined and uncertainties in forecasts of abundance are increasingly being recognized. What I'm interested in asking if you agree with is that part of the sentence that says uncertainties in forecasts of abundance are increasingly being recognized.
Definitely, yes.
And then one more passage in the same paragraph in the right column, about a third down that column, there's a sentence that begins, given large. Do you see that sentence?
Yeah.
Given large uncertainties in environmental effects on population productivity, rigorous model selection procedures are essential when evaluating empirical relationships and identifying predictive models. Do you agree with that statement?
Yes.
As far as I know, this document is not yet an exhibit, and I'd ask that it be the next exhibit.
Exhibit 725.
I want to ask you some questions about the TAM rule, if I may, Mr. English. DFO uses total allowable mortality, or TAM, in setting spawning escapement targets. As I understand it, you suggest that escapement goals for each run timing group are the route to go. Is that right? You're not keen on the TAM rule. You'd rather have what you refer to as escapement goals.
Well, I think it's not an either or in my mind. I think we need to have defined escapement goals. You also need to figure out how you're going to get there, and way you get there may be from using rules that come out of things like the TAM rule. But you need an escapement goal. You need to know what you're striving for.
All right. So do I take it then that you're accepting of, and maybe you'll go so far as to be in favor of TAM, but you're wanting something more? Is that what you're saying?
I'm definitely wanting something more explicit with regard to what the target is, what the escapement goal is. And I think that there are issues associated with the TAM rules that may be resolved as the governments and other parties set these lower and upper benchmarks that are a requirement under the wild salmon policy. But the types of relationships between run size and exploitation rate that the TAM rule is mostly related to are ones that can be effective at getting to an ultimate goal of specific escapement for a specific stock, as long as that goal is defined.
All right. You're familiar, are you, with a term that's been called the cutback point? And there's a graph that is visually displayed on. I don't have it right at my fingertips, but do you know
It's in the page 104 in our report, so if you looked at that, it should have that.
Okay, let's go there. Yes, that's the one. Now, that aims, as I understand it, to provide a structure within which fisheries managers can plan and apply the TAM rules to account for what's happening in season. Have I got that right?
Yeah, it relates the run size to a specific TAM estimate or total allowable mortality rate.
And it in turn is then allowing them to decide what fishing to allow by reference to what is appropriate or what's needed in order to allow for proper escapement, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's the idea.
And does that not achieve what you have been speaking of when you refer to escapement goals?
Not necessarily. Because the escapement goal is not defined by this graph. It defines what you are going to do in terms of allowing harvest at a variable run size.
Aren't we really talking about the same thing coming at it from two different angles? Isn't what you would allow by way of harvest or not allow really the same thing as having an escapement goal? Because it's the reverse side, if you like. The structure, the chart that you see here is saying when to stop harvest, which does have the effect of allowing escapement to occur.
Yeah, so this will tell you what your if you were managing perfectly and obtained a specific harvest rate that you were targeting for that run, it will tell you what escapement would occur if you do that. It doesn't tell you what your goal is, it just tells you what the escapement will be.
All right. Summing up then, as I understand what you're saying, and I invite you to comment on this, you are in agreement with the approach that's taken insofar as the TAM rule exists and is applied, but you would like to see, in addition to that, and as part of the equation, a goal, so you know your end game, if you like.
That's correct, yes.
All right. So in other words, you're proposing to add something to what's already there.
Yeah.
You're not tearing anything down and rebuilding.
Yeah, that's right. To use a sports analogy, which might be easier, you know, you want to know where that goal line is. That's the thing you've got to cross.
All right.
At the end of the day, you don't want it to be constantly shifting.
Do you agree with me that the TAM rule allows for there to be a proper account taken of less productive stocks and gives the ability to protect those less productive stocks?
Yeah, where you put these particular cutback points and no fishing points will provide greater or less protection for the non-target stocks.
And you've spoken to some of this already, but where you have those less productive stocks running with more productive stocks, applying the TAM rule is going to have the effect of cutting back on fishing for all stocks, right? Because of the nature of what you have. That is, you've got mixed stock runs.
Well, that's going to be taken into consideration when presumably when the people define these points. The TAM rule will tell you where the no fishing point is, and whether it's a completely no fishing or a minimum harvest level, which is what it's evolving to now, because there are fisheries expectation that there'll be some level of harvest, even at low stock sizes due to overlaps. It's important to note that the TAM rules are defined by run timing groups, and the run timing groups are not completely distinct. So you have issues with overlap between the run timing groups. Then you also have to define at what point you believe it is safe to have your maximum exploitation rate, and depending on what those numbers are will provide more or less protection for the less productive stocks.
One of the effects of all of this, though, is that you're going to, in protecting the less productive stocks, you're going to be cutting back to a great extent on stocks that are more productive that are running with the less productive stocks.
Yes, you're going to have a lower exploitation on those that could in theory handle a higher exploitation.
And that's a trade-off, if you like, that has to be made in order to favor conservation.
Yeah.
Now, you'll be asked questions by others after me that will come at all of this from a different angle, I'm sure. But, and we can all see the controversy that can rise up in some quarters over this. But it really comes down to putting conservation of stocks ahead of individual fishing and economic opportunity, or the other way around, doesn't it, when you're dealing with the Fraser?
Oh, and any river, Fraser's not unique.
Well, the Fraser has added complexity in part because of the mixed stock runs, doesn't it?
Well, I think there's no fishery that I'm aware of in BC that doesn't have some degree of mixture. There's ones that have, none that have as complex as the Fraser, but there are whether it's Susquehanna, Nass, or Barkley Sound, they all have a mixture of stocks that are being harvested. Just fewer numbers in some cases, like Barkley Sound doesn't have as many sockeye populations as the Fraser for sure, or even the Skeena.
One of your criticisms, as I read your paper, of the TAM rule is that it's hard to communicate and therefore something clearer should exist. Have I read
Yes.
your paper right?
That's correct.
But you'll agree with me, will you, that the fact that something's hard to communicate is not a reason to not do it if it's the right thing to do?
No, it certainly, just makes it complicated doesn't mean you shouldn't do stuff, but you should find a way of communicating very clearly what your goals are, so that people understand what the goals are, and then explain how. Well, I view the TAM rule is a means to an end. The end is what I need to have defined.
All right, that's a fine way of putting it, thank you. Do you agree with me that the methodology used in the TAM rule is a sound one?
It's very reasonable, yes.
You're shifting onto en route loss. Your report, as I read it, could be read as equating en route loss with en route mortality. But whether I've read it right or not, will you agree with me that such things as measurement errors and biases, for example, Mission, and you've talked some of Mission, can contribute to what's included in this term en route loss?
Definitely, yeah. And where it's actually referred to in our paper, it relates it directly to the difference between the estimates of escapement past Mission and spawning grounds.
All right, but you agree that en route loss is more than just fish dying?
That's correct, yes.
Now, I'd like to turn to Bristol Bay and the work there vis-a-vis the Fraser. Clearly have good knowledge of what's there. And the report compares and contrasts the approach in Bristol Bay with the Fraser situation. And you've spoken to differences between the two, and you've spoken to the greater complexity that exists on the Fraser. But I'd like to drill down a bit and just be sure and see if we can get clarity on some of these differences. And I thank you for what you've said already. But I'm going to try and list them out and see if I've got it right. So I'm going to go through it item by item, if you like, and there's maybe 10 or so of these comparing the Fraser to Bristol Bay. The Fraser fishery is in part an international fishery that's governed by the international treaty and the Fraser panel that you spoke of. And fisheries as a department is constrained in what it can do by reference to the treaty versus Bristol Bay, where, as you've described, the area biologists are given a preliminary authority, really, to manage their area as they decide best.
Yes.
So the difference being there is international aspects with an international treaty on the Fraser and constraints that come from that versus no constraints up at Bristol Bay.
Yeah, no international constraints in Bristol Bay, correct.
And in terms of the geography and what the fish have to do, on the Fraser, they travel a very long distance towards the Fraser and then a very long distance in the Fraser, versus Bristol Bay, where they don't actually travel too far by comparison to get to the mouth or the river, and they don't travel very far in the river, do they?
Well, the travel to the river, it may not be that, they don't go as far physically, but they're coming from, rearing areas in the Northeast Pacific and the Bering Sea, and then into Bristol Bay. It's just that there aren't a lot of fisheries along those routes that are intercepting them.
All right. Well, just focusing on that for the moment, that is another difference, isn't it? That there are no interception fisheries with regard to Bristol Bay, but there are with the Fraser.
Yeah, they're really small associated with Bristol
Right.
Bay as opposed to the Fraser.
But back to the distance, when you look at the map, you can see that the Bristol Bay sockeye travel to the river maybe a third at most the distance that the Fraser sockeye travel when they're coming from the Gulf of Alaska.
Yeah, assuming they're all rearing in the same place. A lot of, if you look at the distribution of Bristol Bay sockeye in the Northeast Pacific, it could be very much different than Fraser sockeye. They could be coming from areas much farther west than where the Fraser sockeye arrive from. But my knowledge on those distributions is limited.
All right. And you've spoken to this next point, but on the Fraser, you've got all the stocks going into one river, whereas up at Bristol Bay, each stock feeds into its own river. There's 9 in total.
Yeah, there's a number of stocks. The the way it's managed is for these major, 9 major populations. There could be subcomponents of those, and there no doubt are different lakes. And so if you looked at it from the point of view how we define CUs, conservation units for sockeye, there could be multiple ones within one of those particular river systems because there's multiple lakes.
All right, but the fundamental difference being, though, you've got one or a few stocks going into each of the 9 rivers up at Bristol Bay is distinct from all stocks going into one river with the Fraser.
Yeah, that's
Now,
great.
this next point, I think, is one you haven't spoken to so far, but there's many different gear type associated with fishing Fraser sockeye and different user groups as well. As I understand it, though, up at Bristol Bay, there's only 2 gear type, and I think you referenced this in your report, although I don't
Yes.
think it came out in the evidence this morning. But if I got it right, there's only 2 gear type up there?
That's correct.
And on the Fraser, there's many First Nations. I don't know the number exactly, but there's well over 100. Whereas in Bristol Bay area, there's very few First Nations that are doing fishing, as I understand it.
There are some that harvest both that participate in the marine fisheries, in the district fisheries, and also in the subsistent fisheries in river, but nowhere near to the same portion of the catch as it can be in the Fraser.
And the total catch, and you said this morning, I think, and it's in your paper, the total catch by First Nations in Bristol Bay is less than 1% of the total.
Yeah, that includes subsistence fishing and sport fishing. Subsistence fishing is not necessarily all First Nations in Alaska.
Yes, as I understand it, and see if I've got this right, subsistence fishing in Alaska is anyone, whether you're First Nation or non-First Nation, is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And another
Mr. Taylor,
difference...
Mr. Taylor, in keeping with your sports theme, could I call a timeout?
Sure.
You're going to now recess for 15 minutes? 10 minutes?